The Senate has officially passed the bipartisan infrastructure bill, which approves $550 billion in new spending on physical infrastructure. Now, I'll detail what's in the bill. I'll detail, more importantly, what's not in the bill. But what's fascinating about this is at a time when Democrats and Republicans seem like they can never work together, a lot of Republican senators voted in favor of this bipartisan deal, which should be a red flag more than anything. So the bill passed by a wide bipartisan majority of 69-30, with 19 Republican senators voting for the bill, including Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell. And so what enticed Republican lawmakers, the same Republican lawmakers who are in favor of tax cuts, deregulation, corporate giveaways, why would they vote for $550 billion in new spending? Well, it might have to do with the fact that there are some corporate giveaways here, which I'll get to in just a second, but let's talk about what it does fund. It invests $110 billion in roads, bridges, and major projects, $66 billion in passenger and freight rail, $65 billion to rebuild the electric grid, $65 billion to expand broadband internet access, $39 billion to modernize and expand transit systems, and $7.5 billion to build a national network of charging infrastructure for electric vehicles. That's probably my favorite provision in the bill so far, including what I'm about to read, which is that the bill also includes $55 billion for water infrastructure, $15 billion of which will be directed toward replacing lead pipes. So the water infrastructure is, of course, incredibly important. So there are good things in this bill. I don't want to take away from that. However, we should also focus on what this bill does not include, and more importantly, the corporate giveaways that are involved in this legislation as well. Now, while you have this bipartisan group of senators celebrating bipartisanship, just want to give you a quick excerpt from Ben Burgess's piece in Jacobin, where he writes, "The gap between Biden's initial infrastructure proposal and the bipartisan bill is a catastrophe in human terms. What it has going for it is bipartisanship." And let me take you to this graphic, which shows you what Biden's initial proposal looked like and what the bipartisan deal looks like. So obviously there's quite a bit of cuts in everything from innovation. There's no spending on innovation, no spending on in-home care, no spending on improving buildings. There's some money there for utilities, transportation, and a very small amount for pollution. And of course, not nearly enough to deal with climate change. Now, to give you more details, the original bill had $387 billion for housing, school, and buildings. The bipartisan version has zero. The original infrastructure bill had $400 billion for home and community-based care. The bipartisan version has zero. Even clean energy tax credits, an absurdly inadequate response to the climate crisis, plummeted from $363 billion to $0. But guess what this has going for it? Bipartisanship and selling off public infrastructure to private companies, which we'll get to in just a second.
Yeah, so we told you yesterday on the show that we'll see if, how Washington is going based on how they vote on the $3.5 trillion bill that used to be called an infrastructure bill, but is now being called a budget bill. And that got split out of this because that has most of the Democratic proposals. This is basically, the one they're talking about here is basically the Republican version of the bill. And so that's why it's being celebrated in Washington. But we said, look, maybe there's some chance the Democratic version will pass. Normally I'd tell you there's no way, but the jury's still out on it because people like Nancy Pelosi to Bernie Sanders are so adamant that it's going to pass. So, the thing that we added was, but we'll be able to tell partly in media reaction. So today we have our first important data on how the media is reacting. So when you read the CNN piece, it's not to blame these particular writers. Understand that the writers are generally speaking irrelevant. There's groupthink, and the editors tell you how to write the stories. So they're all written in similar ways in all of these articles. So how do they frame this Republican version of the bill and how do they frame the Democratic version of the bill to give you a sense of which way the media is going to push, okay? And if you think the media doesn't push, you're hilarious. So this one is framed by CNN, for example, as historic and sweeping. Now they took, I know these because in fact I told you that they would call it historic. And it's because I've lived this movie before. Barack Obama, when he did the incredibly weak financial reform bill, the corporate media called it historic.
Dodd-Frank.
Yeah. Right, and so here they are again, and it says, these are all quotes, shore up the nation's crumbling infrastructure. Man, that sounds like it's really needed, which by the way, it is. Like I'll take all of this, except for the part that Anna's about to tell you about, right? But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't do the other one. We should also definitely do the other one, which is more, which is bigger and also desperately needed and would actually shore up our crumbling infrastructure. They again describe it as a wide bipartisan majority. If you just saw that by itself, that's true, but it's in the framing like, oh, that's a really positive thing about this bill. They say the legislation stands to modernize and upgrade the nation's aging and outdated infrastructure. It was not quite described this way before they had agreement, because before they had agreement, the press couldn't tell, wait, are the powerful going to do this or not? Now that the corporate Democrats and corporate Republicans have agreed, CNN thinks this is the most important bill that's ever existed, right? They say it was done after months of painstaking negotiations. These guys are heroes. They say it's a rare example of successful deal making. Now, again, if you just saw that, you say, well, the bill has a lot of good parts. That they seem like they recognize that, no problem, right? No, they're framing it in a way of so that when progressives say, hey, if you don't pass the $3.5 trillion one, we're gonna vote no on this. Then this same press turns around and goes, they're preventing historic reforms. We need to make sure that our crumbling infrastructure doesn't fall on our heads. And it's the progressives that won't let you have it. Guaranteed, mark it down in stone, okay? And then, okay, well then how are they gonna frame the $3.5 trillion one? A little bit further down the article, they say it's a separate and more expansive package. Again, by itself could be okay, but then they go on to say, but expansive is like, this one is bipartisan and reasonable, the other one is expansive. And they say and they explain that Democrats in the House might not vote for it, might not vote for the bipartisan version if they don't get this version. And they say that's, quote, a stand that has been met with criticism from Republicans and pushback from some moderate Democrats. In other words, that is not the reasonable one. No, this Republican version is the reasonable one, and that's the one we should go with. And that's how this game is played. Okay, back to you.
Yeah, but so for progressive lawmakers who inevitably will deal with that mounting pressure to vote in favor of this bipartisan deal in the House, even without a clear path forward with the $3.5 trillion reconciliation version of the bill, they need to understand that they got elected to represent the best interests of their constituents. CNN didn't get elected, an editor at CNN didn't get elected. If they're gonna serve as the PR wing of the White House or PR wing of the Senate, let them do what they're gonna do. But lawmakers need to understand what they got elected for in the first place, and they've made their commitments on national television. AOC on national television said, we're not voting for this bipartisan bill unless there's a clear path forward for the $3.5 trillion reconciliation bill. Nancy Pelosi, House Speaker, claimed that she will not bring the bipartisan bill to a floor vote unless there's a clear path forward for the reconciliation bill. I don't really trust Nancy Pelosi much, but I will say she's not the type that says something like that unequivocally. And so it seems like she intends to follow through on it, but I also, of course, would argue that we should proceed with caution. It's Nancy Pelosi, and if she gets a little bit of pressure from the Biden administration, I have no doubt that she'll cave. But I also want to go to.
I'm sorry to interject, Anna, but it also could be a trick by Pelosi that it might not be caving. So like she says, oh, I'm putting my foot down. So it's all in how the media spins it, right? So then later, if she says, well, there's nothing I could do, I had to at least pass something, then they will probably paint her as not wishy-washy and flip-flopping and she didn't get a priority through. My guess is the corporate media will then say, what a statesman, like this person, what a master legislator, sacrificing her own priorities to get the bipartisan version through.
Yeah, I have no doubt. Look, the media is gonna do what the media is gonna do. We know what they're gonna do. We know it. They've done it 1 billion times. And the Affordable Care Act, this reminds me of the Affordable Care Act. Let's keep it real. Affordable Care Act had incredibly important provisions. There's no question. Allowing 26-year-old people up to the age of 26 to stay on their parents' insurance, doing away with the ability for private insurers to turn people away if they have pre-existing conditions. These are important provisions. Just like some of the funding here for infrastructure is important. However, let's not make any mistakes. This is a corporate giveaway. The reason why Republican lawmakers in the Senate are in favor of this bill is because their corporate donors are in favor of the bill. So there's a portion, I mean, it's literally thousands and thousands of pages long. But the part that I cared about the most is they're not raising taxes on the wealthy. And they claim that, Democrats specifically claim that they want to make sure that they have pay-fors set and ready to go. So what are the pay-fors? Well, there's a portion in the bill that talks about asset recycling, something that we covered in detail on this show. They're going to privatize public infrastructure. And when they do, these corporations who are leasing our infrastructure get to implement tolls and fees, and it ends up becoming a tax on the backs of working people. Now, there's a part in the bill, the way that it's written now, indicating that these entities are not allowed to implement tolls or fees toward those who make less than $400,000 a year. But there's no enforcement mechanism in the legislation. What are they gonna do? Are they gonna stop cars and say, oh, how much, can I please see your tax returns? Make sure you're not making more than 400,000 a year. You know, we don't wanna implement a toll that could hurt you. No, come on, it's ridiculous. There's no enforcement mechanism, none. They're gonna privatize infrastructure, that's what they're gonna do.
So there was another portion of the bill that had a gas tax. And so the Republicans said, well, of course we don't want to tax the rich, that's an outrage, right? But let's tax the average American, make sure they pay more money in taxes. That way, that's a higher percentage of their income, and it really crushes the average worker. But for CEOs who are our donors, the gas tax doesn't affect them at all. They don't care, right? So now the Democrats did take that out, so credit where credit is due on that. But apparently, they kept in the part about privatizing things, at least to some degree, and then cover it up with, don't worry, we will not charge tolls for people making under 400,000. Come on, guys, you know that's comical, right?
Yeah, it's ridiculous.
There is no toll machine that tells people how much money, that tells the government how much money you're making as you're driving by in your car, nor should there be. Okay, and so that's absurd. And by the way, we have a petition on this, tyt.com/petitions. You go there and you'll see it. It's saying, hey guys, don't fall for this trick. And why do I talk so much about the media? Because it's the media that go and lean on progressives. Hey, just give in, just only do the Republican version, only do the Republican version. Our petition says do not do that, stick with your promises, and make sure that you're voting on both in the House. If they vote on this one first, it's the only one you'll ever get. You'll never hear the $3.5 trillion one first, ever again. If they vote on the $3.5 trillion one in the Senate and send it over to the House, and the House votes on it first, great, then no problem. Then I say vote yes on this, and then do a new bill. You guys are Democrats, you're in charge. You could do a new bill saying, kidding, we weren't privatizing.
They're never gonna.
I know they're never gonna.
Yeah, I mean that's like the most utopian,
no way.
Fantasy world ever. But no, I mean, and by the way, one final, just this is trivia, but I think it's hilarious. The provision where they talk about privatizing public infrastructure is, they titled it asset concessions. So the government, it's engaging in asset concessions to corporations who will then manage that infrastructure and charge you money for using it. Asset concessions.
Why do we have to make concessions?
We don't. There were no concessions made by massive corporations and banks when they got money from the Fed because they needed liquidity. There was no nickel and diming there. Okay, there was no discussion about taking their assets and handing it over to the American people as they were being bailed out. So I think it's fascinating here that we're having a discussion about asset concessions to corporations who just want to nickel and dime the American people for using infrastructure that used to be public. that was already funded by taxpayer money in the development of that infrastructure. But now corporations can make money off of it if it becomes privatized. I think that progressives should fight that provision even if they agree to vote for the bipartisan bill.
So one of my favorite quotes is from a local progressive California, Eric Olson, who said about the supermajority that Democrats have in California, why are we still negotiating? We have a supermajority, we don't need to negotiate with Republicans. It looks like we're negotiating with the donors instead. And that's exactly what's happening here. Democrats control the House, the Senate, and the White House. They're not negotiating with Republicans, they're negotiating with their own donors and having to give concessions to them when they didn't need to give any concession at all to corporations. Thanks for watching The Young Turks, really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR. So those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.